This is Warroad History Interview number 5. Today is Monday, March 17th, 2025. My name is Brady Swanson, and I am joined by Art Johnston at the Warroad Heritage Center. Art comes from a lineage of commercial fishermen and owns the title as the last commercial fisherman on the American side of Lake of the Woods. So, thank you, Art, for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks for the interest.
Yeah, so we're just going to get straight off into the commercial fishing questions.
Sure.
But we're going to start with your family. So you come from a long line of commercial fishermen. Can you explain that?
Sure. I go back here. My great-grandfather, Chris Gould, he was the first one of the family that moved up here back in 1903, back when the whole Lake of the Woods area was opened up to white settlement. It used to be part of the Indian reservation. It was opened up in, I think, 1903. And anyway, he was fishing here, and I understand that he had a sailboat called the Grizzly, and I don't know what they fished, but he was the first fisherman. Gould's Point up in Buffalo Bay is named after him. Then my grandfather, Albert Johnston, he married Chris Gould's daughter, Mabel. And he was a boat builder and a fisherman too. Back in those days, everybody fished, right? Everybody in Warroad, the Arnesons, the Johnstons. I mean, everybody that was here fished. So my grandpa, he fished, and he built boats and everything. And then we get him back to my father. And of course, my uncle, Dorns, he fished ponets. We got a bunch of his ponnet displays here. And my father fished gill nets. And so I started going out on the boat when I was really young. You'd just go out. My father was also a Coast Guard lamplighter.
Okay.
And so we went all around the lake repairing putting batteries in the lights. We just threw the old batteries over the side. Hey, we don't do that anymore, luckily. But hey, lots of funny other stories we could talk about. And then, of course, I started my own fishing gear back when I was probably, in the 20s. I would find other fishermen that are getting too old to fish anymore, and they hadn't died yet, so the fishing gill net license was available, so I used that.
Okay.
And my brother fished, and say Dorrance and my cousin David, Dorrance's son, they had ponets.
Okay.
And I can go into more detail on that if you want.
Yeah.
All those gears.
So you know roughly when you started fishing with your father?
Oh boy, probably the first time I actually went out fishing, picking tulipies or walleyes out of the net was probably, I guess I was probably 12 years old, and that must have been about 1962, 63, sometime in there. Okay. Then I started going out. It was really interesting nowadays. My brother and I, we would go out. I mean, him and I would go out and end up lifting all the nets. And I was like 12 or 13, and my brother was 16. And we'd go out on these really junky boats we had back then. Somehow we survived. I don't know. But, so then, I started going out by myself probably when I was 17 or 18. And gill netting, we'll talk about that. The gill netting can be a one-person operation. Okay. Oh, it gets kind of lonely out there. And usually we pick people to help in the hard times when you got a ton of tulipies in the boat or moving nets and stuff. And we can talk about the difference between ponnets and stuff.
Yeah.
And the trawler, too. I know you want to talk about that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. All right, so what does a typical day on the lake look like for you?
Okay, so I'll talk about here when I started fishing. Okay, you get up in the morning, you get up early. You always try to get out there at sunrise. And the fishermen used to kind of jockey who's going to get to the Selvag dock first. But you'd get up in the morning, you do some eating and run down to the boat. You got your oilers. You had to put in your oilers. Oilers, what people call rain gear now. And I could talk about that, but that's changed over the era a lot too. And then we'd have rubber boots on. If it was cold out, we had to have some kind of wool coats underneath the oilers. And we'd go to the Selvag fishery, and we had to get ice. Ice was a critical part of any kind of fishing. And when I started, there was all kinds of ice machines. Back when my father started, they used to cut ice, like some of the displays we have here, about one right there.
One right there, yeah.
Is that they had to cut ice out of there, but they got fairly good ice-making machinery. So we'd go stop at the fishery, either ours. Later on, it was my own fishery, but once back in the older days, we had Selvog Fishery and then Maury Fish Company. We'd load up our boats with ice, and we had fish boxes. Fish boxes were critical. We had to have something to put on there. Old fish boxes were made out of wood. We'd pound them together, and sometimes they would fall apart a lot. They'd get rotten. Lawrence Arneson actually lost a finger by catching on a nail on a fish box, and that's why you have missing one finger. But then the later days, we got plastic boxes.
Okay.
And that was really nice because, hey, they didn't rot. You didn't have to replace them. You didn't have to worry about, you're picking up this 100-pound box of fish, and the side falls out, and all the fish fall in there.
Yeah.
So we'd get ice. You'd go out. We'd find our nets, which was interesting. On gill nets, we fished all over the lake, and usually it depended. We'd often go out in a small boat. Back in the old days, they had launches and they had lifting boats they would tow behind. Some of the fishermen kept doing that, and the Brewsters kept using a launch and their smaller lifting boats. Other fishermen, like say over in Rocky Point and Buzzy Lem and Don Hurd, they would just get on their small boats, go out a few miles where their nets are, and come back. So hey, we'd find our nets. You get the fish out, you pack them in ice, and then you go back, and then we would either, back in the older days, we used to sell all our fish at Selvogs or Maury Fish Company. Back when things were changing, and we knew then, I ended up doing as much value added as I could by filleting all my own fish and stuff. So then you'd go back, sell the rough fish. Mink farms were gone by then, so I'd sell the rough fish to Maury Fish Company, and then hey, I'd go back and I'd play up all the walleyes. That's where all the money was in the walleyes. So that was kind of our day, and we had to make sure there was gas in the boat.
Yeah.
Make sure the motors ran. Back then, the motors weren't that as dependable then as they are now. But I'm sure I must have missed some other stuff. Oh, we had to have oilers. Oilers were critical. We had to have, for gill nets, we had to have specialty equipment. I tried to find this, and I couldn't find it before I left Brody. I had one sitting on my workbench, and couldn't find it. We had a fish hook. Which was critical to untangle the fish out of a gill net.
Okay.
We'd have that in our hands, a little thing about this long. We'd make it ourselves, whip a bunch of twine around the bent over nail, and that's how we would pick the fish out. So you had to have those tools, of course. Had to have anchor, So we did not have any GPS. We didn't use any Lorano. I never used that on the lake.
So when you're setting like gill nets, you're setting them once in the day. You come back the next day, harvest, and then reset it?
The gill nets, we can talk about the difference between that and trap nets. I fish trap nets too, should ask me about that. But the gill nets are very low capital intensive. So I had 3,000 feet. I was allowed legally to have 3,000 feet of gill net, and a gill net, all my gill net gear. And the one picture I got of my dad's book, that's all my gill nets. They probably weigh 300 or 400 pounds, a whole gear, anchors and everything. Where trap nets and paw nets, like my uncle fished, that'd weigh tons.
Oh yeah.
You had to have a big boat. So they were very portable. Gill nets are very, very portable. And typically what we would do is, we called them gangs. We have 3,000 foot was our legal limit. We'd have 3,000 foot nets. We call them gangs. And for some reason, fishing always came in 500 foot. Don't ask me why, but hey, we used to make our own gill nets and stuff, or to a certain extent. I could talk about that. So anyway, you go out there, you set the net. There's an anchor on each end. There's a little buoy coming up here to lift the nets. You pull up the buoy. The anchor line's about 200 feet long. You got your net stretching 1,000 feet the other way with another anchor line in. And you'd pull that net up on the back of your boat or on the front of your boat. Some fishermen lifted over the back, some lifted over the front. And you'd literally pull the boat along, which would lift the net up, the fish would come up. And if it was windy, you tried to get the wind to help you. Of course, you try to, every trick you could to try to minimize the physical labor. It was a lot of work, actually. So the nets would stay in there. You got done the other end of the net would just drop back. back in, and it would stay there until you pulled the net. We usually did two different operations. Lifting the nets means you just pull up, take the fish out, the net would stay there. You wouldn't pull the anchors out. If your fishing was good, hey, you leave it there, right? Ooh, hey, I got a bunch of walleyes, or and a bunch of tulipies, or hey, I got a bunch of suckers. I want to move the nets because, hey, they're not worth anything. Mm-hmm. So they just rip up the nets for nothing. So if the fishing is good, you leave them there. And what I used to do is we had 3 gangs of 1,000 foot, and I'd usually two, and you keep taking one net, and you would experiment. I'm going to go over off of Elm Point, or let's go off Archie's Reef, over toward the north-south boundary, and see how the fishing is over there. So the gill net would generally stay in the water all the time. And one thing about gill nets, the difference between gill nets and pond nets, is gill nets were not possible to be used until you had good boats, reliable boats, because the gill net kills the fish. And if it's a warm, like in the summertime, you have to get out there. You got to lift those nets every day. Otherwise, you're going to get spoiled fish. So you have to go out and lift them every day. Where a pond net, they'd go out and lift those every few days because theoretically, I'm saying theoretically, I hope you ask me why, they're a live fish gear, and they just keep accumulating fish, and they'd go out there and pick the fish out. So the gill net would stay in the water usually all the time until the fish moved. Like you wouldn't fish it out, the fish always were moving. Wind would come up in one way, you get smashed with tulipies. Next day the wind would change direction, there's no tulipies there at all. And then you have to go find them if you're fishing for tulipies. The walleye is the same thing. It totally depended on where the wind was blowing. And because the fish moved so fast in the lake, and I don't think the fishery biologists know that, but anyway, it was good. So here I'm talking too much.
No, you're all good. You're all good. So with the gill nets, how deep are you setting those? Like what depth are you dropping?
Usually the normal gill net is it sits on the bottom, unless we put floaters on them. And why you put them on the bottom is that's the easiest way, because a gill net, you have a float line and a lead line, literally a lead line. Let me talk a little bit about this, and sorry if I'm rambling on too much.
You're good.
But back in the old days, we had cotton nets. This was before my time, back when my dad started fishing back in the 40s. Nylon came around, I think, during the war, the synthetic fibers. And so back in the cotton net days, they would, if you didn't pull the nets out and dry them, my dad's book name is Time to Fish, Time to Dry Nets, you had to dry the cotton, or otherwise they would just rot. So nylon came along, and we didn't have to dry the nets anymore. So that was really cool. You could leave them in all, you wouldn't have to move them at all. But the interesting thing on that is we had leads. This I was just thinking about this, and thanks for bringing this up here, Brady. Sorry if I'm rambling too much. But we had our leads. Every 6 foot we would put a lead. We would actually make the leads. This was lead, and we had a little form. It heat it up. It had the plumber's torch and melt the lead, put it in a little mold, and then eventually all your lines. We used to use 3/16 inch nylon lines for top and bottom, and then you make the lead, and then you'd pound the lead on there. The lead is very malleable, and that's why we used it. It's also heavy. And so then the lead would be on there on the bottom. And now the trouble with the lead every 6 foot, to get this little lead that weighed, I don't know, probably several ounces or something, is they tangle up. Every time you pull the nets, everything tangles. So in later years, my brother, we found, we keep looking around, and they finally made lead line, it was called, where the lead was actually embedded right in the line. It was Kern mantle rope, and it was right in the line. So we never tangled up anymore. The same with the float lines. You would, the lead and the floats. So anyway, the lead line would bring it down to the bottom. Get back to your question, sorry.
No, you're good.
Then you got the float line would be up there, and we tried to minimize ways to keep the nets from tangling, which is different from a pond net. The pond net, we want to talk about that in the trap nets, but gill nets can tangle really, really easy. So we did everything we could to minimize the tangling, and sometimes it was tough. So the lead on the bottom, you couldn't just let the net float in the middle. it would just sit on the bottom.
Okay.
So normally it sat on the bottom, except unless we put floaters on. That way we'd tie another line with usually a Hilux jug.
Yep.
Fishermen still use Hilux jugs. We call them Hilux jugs. Any kind of soap container now, a little plastic container. And you put a rope in that attached to the float line, and that holds it off the bottom. Why would we do that? We never wanted to get suckers because we get almost nothing for them, and they would tear up the nets bad. So we would float the nets up to get away from the suckers, and also the tulipies, we'd get less tulipies on that too.
Okay.
Sometimes the walleyes would come up, particularly on a full moon. We thought when it was calm out, the walleyes would come up high, and so we just kept playing around with that. But normally the nets would sit on the bottom. Unless you put the floaters, and then if you put a floater on, trouble with that is more things to tangle.
Yep.
So it was interesting. We had to keep weighing off the possibility of tangling your nets with where do you want your net to be? How do you want to get out of the suckers? Do you want to get all the crabs? Do you want to get all the clamshells? I mean, all those kind of things that occasionally just tangle up in the net a lot.
So for depth-wise in the lake, are you fishing at 6 feet? Are you fishing at 14? Are you dropping it at 32 feet? I mean,
yeah, well, Lake of the Woods, of course, on the Minnesota side is shallow, maximum about 40 feet. Mud bottom, most of them, unless you're near some of the shores. So, the regulations limited where we could fish. And the last was usually we couldn't fish in less than 15 foot of water. And I don't know what difference that made. It didn't make any difference in our catch, but we didn't want to fish anything less than that because the net, we were allowed 3,000 foot of gill nets, and the regulations had 30 mesh deep.
okay.
And so we would actually sew the gill net. We would buy the gill net. It's obviously you can't make your own gill nets, but we would sew that on the lead line and the float line. We do that ourselves, and we usually had to replace the nets about twice a year because they'd get too tangled and ripped up. So depending on how often you put the seaming line on there, what the space is between the line, how many, this is like knitting. Yeah, I'm a knitter too. And it's like, you pick up 4 meshes every 6 inches was typically what we used to sew the nets together. And that meant the net was about 8 foot tall. The more you spread out, we were allowed 30 meshes deep, but depending on how far you spread them out on the lines and how deep your net would be.
Okay.
And our theory was that we wanted to have kind of a diamond-shaped mesh. We thought that would catch the walleyes best, or the tulipies. Hey, that's the shape of a fish.
Yeah.
So the nets came out to be about 8 foot deep, and we were limited where we could fish. We didn't like to fish in shallow water because one, if you have a lot of wind, it can get tangled up. Boats can run into them and stuff, and so.
So there's a floating marker that's marking your net. So if it's on the bottom, there's something on the top saying there's a net on the bottom.
Yeah, because it's going to be beyond that. The sport fishermen, as we really tried to, and I think we could have survived the whole sport fishing onslaught, because we really tried to avoid conflict with people. Where sport fishermen we quit fishing on the reefs. We did that long before fishing ended, tried to minimize conflict. So the boats are not going to hit it. There's a buoy on each end, but people would see, hey, you can go right over that. But if you're fishing with a hook and line, you could catch the net in the middle. But most of the people, we would try to fish where there wasn't any hook and line fishermen anymore.
Got it. So how did you adapt to weather? Obviously, weather and fishing and the lake is kind of they go hand in hand. So, I mean, if it's a stormy day and you got to get gill nets, what's happening?
Well, as I say, gill nets, you have to lift them every day. And if it's really windy, I was very dedicated. I'd go out there every day. In the fall, the fish will stay in a gill net for a week where they won't die when it's colder water. In the summertime, you got to get out there every day. Luckily, there's not as many storms in the midsummer like in July. So if there's wind, you just gotta get out there. And our boats, it was interesting. I think I mentioned before, some of the boats would have a launch, which was the bigger boat. Then they'd tow the lifting boats behind, and that would be more comfortable running. But as we got older, and the fishermen on Long Point and Rocky Point, they never had any launches because of Hay Island. They never had any launches there. Launches, the boat launch, and you could just go out there and pick up the fish. I fished all over the lake, so yeah, you just had to deal with the weather. And our boats were not that good. They were certainly getting better by the 70s, but they were still not as good now. Of course, now I got a boat that I drive all around Lake Superior and stuff, and I like the big waves. I like big waves. You just deal with it, and it just isn't really an issue. Lightning storms are always kind of scary out on the lake. You know, you've probably been out there and you get lightning storms. As fronts are moving over, everything is weird, and all the boats are humming and everything. And but you just deal with it. The thing we used to say was, when there's lightning storm, I always try to be lower than the guy, than my helper. Me and Dave Willems used to fish together a lot.
Were there any? Do you recall any time where the weather was so bad you couldn't pull a net?
No, we did it almost every day. Some fishermen weren't as dedicated as me. If it was really bad, they wouldn't go out, and that's probably makes sense because bad weather, people die in bad weather. We know that, and but I've been out there and lifting nets in 15-foot waves in Lake of the Woods. And, you just do it. Yeah. It's a pain in the neck, but it's got to be a thing that, hey, I got to get those fish. So if I don't get these fish in, I don't make any money, right?
Yeah.
And it began to be a thing for me that I'd go out there. And I literally did not miss a day. I think the last 5 years I fished, I don't think I missed one day because of weather. It'd be rainy and soggy. Of course, you're supposed to ask me how I found the nets when I'm on a rainy day. And we had no visibility. But
yeah. So how long was the fishing season?
From June 1st to October 31st. That was illegal. That was what the commissioner's order had, when we could fish.
Okay. So it wasn't like you're fighting the ice, it's...
Well, actually, we used to have a bit of ice in October sometimes. I remember literally being out there in freezing weather and snowstorms and everything. And it would, the river would be froze here. We'd take our boats out. We'd have to break ice in the river. But really, that wasn't that uncommon in the end of October to be breaking ice. And then sometimes you'd get ice forming out on the lake, and the lily pad ice would be forming, and you try to find your nets. All your buoys are knocked over as they got all covered with ice, and you can't find anything. But it wasn't. You get cold, on the ice, but you deal with it.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about what the operation you ran. You ran a gill net operation, but you also said that you were using some of the trap nets as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the whole history of that is that back, we couldn't transfer licenses, and we'll get to that. I'm sure you'll ask about what happened in the politics. But since we couldn't transfer licenses, I wanted to fish because, hey, that was kind of in my blood, right? Yeah, I fished a lot, and so the DNR would give us a license for trap nets. And so my brother and I, we both fished trap nets. We got trap net licenses. And we bought several types of trap nets, trying to make a go at it. But it did not work. It wasn't economical. We couldn't do it. And it was too expensive, and it just did not work. But we did try trap nets for several years. We fished trap nets too. And when we first started getting out, my brother and I would get a trap net license. We'd try to fish these trap nets, but then we'd use my father's gill net license. That's how we made all the money, was my father's gill net license. Okay. We tried to make him go with the trap nets, but we never made a go at it. I don't know, is that because we weren't skilled enough? Trap nets were new to us, and there was no other trap nets on the lake. Okay. We got trap nets from one batch from Lake Michigan. We got another batch of trap nets from Lake Erie, I think Lake Erie, yeah. And so we bought a bigger boat, and that would handle trap nets and stuff, and with big net lifters on them and all that kind of stuff. So we tried, and I could talk a little bit about that too, if you want.
So what you say trap net? Are they like hoop net, fike nets?
They're like a pound net. The pound net behind me here.
Yep.
Except they're underwater. And the pound net has posts on there, and that's how they tie them to, and the net comes up above the water. A trap net is the same configuration. You got the pot, you got the wings, you got the lead going out there, and but that's all underwater, and it's held by anchors instead of posts.
Okay.
And it was fairly elaborate. We used to have, we had hundreds of anchors, thousands of feet of anchor line, and we fished off a sandy beach. We tried it there. We eventually used the trap nets that I had to take fish. Eventually, we had this agreement, which we'll get to eventually, on the politics of fishing. And let me talk a little bit of the difference between the two here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, a pound net is was always, that was the original kind of fish, because people didn't have reliable transportation or boats, so you had to have some kind of a live fish net, live fish, quote unquote. So the nets, they started building pond nets. They've been built pound nets or trap nets for probably a couple of years, ever since people knew how to make twine or string. They could do it. And so to make them preserved, they tarred the net. So there's a whole big process. And so why did we tar nets? Even after we got nylon that went rot, we still tarred the nets. And maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but the tarring did, the lead out there was big mesh. You can see the way I think Dorrance made this. And wouldn't catch the fish. And fish would come along and hit this. They'd follow that down there, they'd get in the hearts, and they'd eventually make their way back into the pot. And the tar made it so that the fish was less likely to gill, but make them last forever. You only had to tar your nets once a year. And they had different size mesh everywhere. And the pot was small, so the fish wouldn't escape. So the tar so the nets were you wanted them very stiff and rigid so they wouldn't gill the fish. Although they did gill fish, but I hope you asked me about that. But so the tar also was black, and my theory is that the fish would come along, see this lead, and they would follow that lead down thinking it was some kind of vegetation and finding kind of fish. They'd end up out in the pot, and the pot was always away from the shore, and the fish always went in deeper water. And so that's kind of how that worked. And on a trap net, we'd actually had to pull this pot up onto our boat and empty the fish out. Where Dorrance Johnston, my uncle, he had the pond nets, and he'd just bring the boat alongside with a big scoop and just scoop the fish out of that.
And do you know how those pound nets were set?
Kind of. I think I'd mentioned to you, I think the last guy is probably still alive that helped Dorrance was Bob Johnson. He was one of his right-hand men. They had barges, and my uncle was really good at this, and those things were so straight. And I don't know how he did it, but he could do it. He had the system down. That's why I say, ask Bob Johnson. He's probably the best one in town that would know how do they set those lines so straight, because he was really good, and they could do it fast. And this is pretty intensive, having a pond net. Versus a gilling. I could do that all by myself. The whole thing weighed 300 pounds. These things would weigh tons.
Well, because each one of those posts is a massive timber that has to be driven into the bottom of the lake, and then he would have 3 of them. I think the license allowed 3, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that. I forget how many he was up along Buffalo Point and Elm Point. He had that up right to the very end. And that was driving, and he would bring his barge. He had a big barge. He'd bring out there. He had a pile driver on the barge, and he would get out there, and boy, he could drive those things fast. And then he'd hang the nets on them, and then it'd stay there, and then he had to pull everything out in the fall again. But the trap net, we didn't have that, so we were much more flexible. We could move the trap net. It was still hard because you had to have these things weighed a ton. Literally a ton, and you had to have net lifters on there to pull the trap net, and it was real labor intensive. And but the DNR was pushing that kind of stuff, and hey, maybe hold on to that till he asked me about the end of the fishing days.
So, like your trap nets, that operation probably looks similar to what like a lobster or crab fisherman does on the ocean, where there's a line, they've got a something that's pulling that heavy net or that trap out of the water where you're dumping it and
Yep.
then tossing it over again.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Trap nets are fairly common. Lake Erie still has trap nets. There's some on Lake Superior. It's a fairly common way to catch fish. Although the gill net is by far the most efficient way to do it. But the gill net, we'll get into the politics. Some people say, ooh, gill nets are these bad things. And that's all BS. But anyway, that's on crabs or lobster pots. Hey, you got to get that. You bring the live lobster up there, and hey, when people buy it in the restaurant, they throw the live lobster in the boiling water and eat it. So there's different reasons.
So what kind of other equipment were you using besides nets? You mentioned the oilers, the water protective gear. What other stuff? I mean, as a gill net fisherman, you said it's pretty low capital.
Yeah.
What else are you needing?
Net needles. Again, Dorrance has a bunch of them. Net needles. On the trap nets, you have to mend it. When you get a hole in them, you have to mend it. And so that was something that Dorrance taught me how to mend nets when we got into trap netting. So you have to have net needles. You got to have twine. You got to have, what else do you need? So some things that we just take for granted, and we need to have a gill hook. It was very simple to make, but without a gill hook, I mean, you would be out there all day trying to get fish out of a net. We didn't use any depth sounders. We tried them; they never lasted. The boats we used, because we're out there, and every day it was just beating boats. It would really beat the heck out of your boats. And none of our depth finders would work. Radios did not work. We used to have CB radios, and they came out. Anyway, I just beat those to heck, and they would just fall apart. So what else did we have? That's really about it. We didn't use any maps at all. We just remember where the nets were. And boy, there must be something more. Fish boxes, ice were critical for fishing. We need to have ice. And
Did you purchase that ice from Selvags or Maury's, or would you go there and they just load you up on it?
Yeah, because the deal was that we would get ice from them and we would sell them the fish.
Okay.
So then when I started later years, when I started playing up on my own walleyes to get more money, then I had to have my own ice machine. There's a little that was pretty loose. Did you get your ice? Did you get all your ice from your machine, or did you get it from my machine? There was always a little bit of that, but we tried to be gentlemen about it. And if I wasn't going to give any walleyes, because Maury Fish Company, he needed walleyes. That's how he made money too. And if I just got the ice from him, just gave him the tulipies and the suckers and the northerns, he would not be happy. John LaChapelle was the manager there, and we tried to work that out the best we could. But generally, we didn't pay for the ice. Ice machines were expensive to keep operating and stuff. But
do you remember what prices you were paid for the fish at Selvags or Maury's?
Let's see. I think I'll take a wild ass guess here. Wag it here, as we say in engineering. I'm thinking in the last years, I was getting probably about $1 a pound for the walleyes. Tulipies were probably 5 cents a pound. Suckers were maybe 5 cents a pound. Northerns were probably around 25 cents a pound. So that was somewhere in that area. Again, we could look it up somewhere. I'm sure there are records that we got, but somewhere that was it. If I flayed the fish myself, I would, I last sold my fillets at $4 a pound. And you get, basically you want to go 2 for 1. You get about, you get 4 pounds. That was equivalent to 2 pounds on the round.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there. But the tulipies and suckers, old burbot, I never sold a burbot once in my life to anybody.
Really?
Nobody wanted a burbot ever.
Really?
And when I started fishing intensely, the fur farms were pretty much all gone, so it wasn't an issue. But we don't catch many burbot. The gillnets catch real few burbot.
Okay.
We talk about the gillnets just a little bit since they brought that up. And hey, cut me off here, Brady, if I'm rambling too much. The gillnet was very selective in size. It had a very selective size on the walleye, about about 1.5 pounds to a little over 2 pounds. That was probably literally 95% of our catch would be that size.
Okay.
Big walleyes, anything over like 24 inches, are pretty rare. We would not get them in that. But you would get big fish in trap nets and pound nets, and apparently in the trawl got big walleyes too. But gill nets would not get big walleyes. They wouldn't get small ones, just that middle size, which I think was really a good resource system. Saugers, we got almost no saugers. They were too small. Except, as I mentioned earlier, as we talked here, back when we had multi-filament during a thunderstorm, the saugers would bite onto the multi-filament nylon, and we'd get a slews of saugers during thunderstorms in the night. It's actually kind of interesting, those little study things. You won't read about that in the fishing reports. Tulipies were very standard size. We'd get about a pound, a little over a pound tulipy. And a tulipy was really easy. We call squeezing tulipies. You pick them out, you just literally squeeze the net around them, and you throw them into the box. The walleye, you had to use a gill hook because they would need a little more, they would sometimes get tangled. Suckers were a standard size, about 1.5 pound sucker. You didn't get small ones, didn't get big ones. Burbot, you got very few burbots. Northern pike was the only exception to a gill net because we got nothing on the northern, probably less than, 2 feet long, because they're too small. We call them, what do we call them? Call them hammer handles, the little northerns, or we call them jackfish, and JAX. And but the big ones, we get the way their mouth is arranged, it would tangle into the gill net, and we'd get big northerns. Wasn't unusual to get a 10-pound northern. Nothing less than probably 2 pounds on a northern, or 3 pounds, maybe 4 pounds. But we'd get big ones because they would tangle up with all the way their mouth is arranged. So that was kind of the thing. The gill nets were very selective in size.
Okay. Let's see here. We talked about the equipment. So you mentioned multi-filament.
Yeah.
So originally nets were made from cotton, and then you had mentioned that they had started transitioning into the 40s or so. Can you explain kind of multi-filament versus monofilament?
Yeah. That's we started out before my time, before I was born. They used cotton, of course, and as I say, that's why my dad's book, Time to Fish, Time to Dry Nets. They had to pull the cotton nets and dry them. Then, I understand, nylon was a product of the World War II, the synthetic ropes. And so then we started having very fine nylon, and then that replaced all the cotton. And that was multi-filament. Then monofilament came around, I'm guessing, it became fairly popular for gill nets, I'm guessing in the 70s or something. It was interesting because some fishermen liked monofilament, some didn't. Because the Brewsters would never use monofilament. I don't think the Arnesons used monofilament. Me and my brother, we were about the only ones who used monofilament on it. And some people thought they would catch more fish. Some people thought they would catch less. But the monofilament, the reason we liked it, it was a much cleaner fishing. We never got saugers. As I say, the saugers would bite onto the multifilament. We never got saugers on monofilament. We never got crabs, crayfish, because they wouldn't get tangled up in the monofilament either. So we liked it because it was just a cleaner net. I don't know if it caught anymore. We always used to argue, we were using multifilament. Then they used to, sometimes they'd dye it green, sometimes people would dye it blue, and monofilament just comes in clear. And so that's, we didn't see any difference. You talk to the people that hate commercial fishing, oh my gosh, monofilament is just this horrible thing. Yeah, that's all. It's complete BS.
Yeah.
Complete BS.
Well, it's the same monofilament that they sell for fishing.
Yeah, exactly.
So
they can use it, but we couldn't.
Yeah.
Right?
So, my mind, when I think of monofilament, I'm thinking of fishing line. Now, I mean, it's the same as a fishing line, but, kind of have any idea about, the test poundage on that monofilament on those gill nets? Was it pretty?
Boy, we when we bought the gill nets, and I forget now, of course, we'd buy the gill net material, and we would specify the size. And yeah, well, I don't remember. I'm guessing the pound test would be somewhere around 15 pounds or something.
Okay.
I think it was normally smaller than the sportsmen use. Oh, I don't hook and line fish at all, as you can probably know why. But I don't know. But it was about the same strength. The multi-fill and the mono were about the same. But both of those we had to replace because they would get ripped up. Sometimes the fish would tangle, they just rip the nets. Sometimes you'd have a big hole, which we thought was probably a sturgeon, would go right through a gill. We wouldn't catch any sturgeon with gill nets at all. They'd go right through it and rip it apart. And
So there'd just be a big hole where you're like, oh, that was a sturgeon.
yeah, we thought that must have been a sturgeon. If there was some big hole in the net, yeah, that's usually what we thought. We didn't know what it was, but it would just be a big hole there. Occasionally you'd get caught on rocks back when we used to fish on the reefs. Occasionally sportsmen would pull up and cut up our gear and stuff. I mean, that would happen, occasionally too.
Did a monofilament net cost any more than a multi-filament?
No. I remember it being about the same. I don't remember much difference.
Okay.
However, they use net making machines, just like looms and everything, or knitting machines. I don't know how they made them and stuff, but they think were about the same price, and they were relatively inexpensive. On a gill net, we could buy a whole set of gill nets. We had to sew them on the lead and float lines. We did that ourselves, but probably a couple $1,000s a year we'd buy a whole set of nets somewhere.
Moving on to boats. What kind of boats did you use? You mentioned that, for lifting nets, you'd also mentioned the launch. Are these wood boats, aluminum boats? How big are these boats?
I'll go back to my dad's when my dad was younger, and my dad's book has a bunch of pictures of the old, they called them launches, and they were all wooden boats. My grandpa was a boat builder, and we didn't have outboard motors. They didn't have outboard motors back then. Any ones that were any dependable. I remember when my dad got the first outboard motor, that was really something. But so they would often roll. We call them lifting boats. The launch would be there, and they had some kind of universal engine, and probably not a very good motor, but it was enough to get around. I'm guessing they were probably 30-foot boats, typically the wooden boat. That would be called the launch. And they were, and in the winter or in the fall, they'd probably put wood stoves in them and stuff to keep warm. And they were open, so then they'd get to their nets. They'd pull up the lifting boat from the back. They're towing that with a rope. They get in the lifting boat, and before that outboard, they'd roll over to where the nets were. And then they'd lift up the nets, and then somebody had the launcher go over and pick them up again, depending on the wind. You couldn't row against if there was a strong wind. So that was back in the old days. Back in the old days on the trap nets and the pound nets, Dorrance, he had bigger boats. You had to have bigger boats for them. Dorrance had steel boats that I think he bought in Lake Superior that he converted over to pound net boat. He had the smaller boats. Don't have a model here, but those are wooden boats that he used for his lifting boats typically. And he just used his big boat to bring the nets out there, and then he'd use a small boat to lift the nets. And the gill netters were the same way. Then we got more modern times. We hardly ever had a launch at all when I grew up, because we had outboards that were good. So we get hit on our, go from Warroad out to Archie's Reef or out to Sandy Beach. And sometimes it'd beat you up really hard if you're going into a wind. If you're going into 8-foot waves, it'd be really hard, but you can make it. And much more faster than a launch. So as the boats got better, I never used a launch. We did have one, the one boat that burned up that we had, we kind of used that as a launch. But the only people that used launch at the end and gill netters were the Brewsters. They had a launch, and there was a new modern, I don't know, that was probably a 40-foot fiberglass boat with a cabin cruiser type of thing. They pulled their boats on with that, their lifting boats. And so they always used the launch. They fished over in Sandy Beach, Stony Point. But the rest of us, nobody else used launches. We all used the small boats because outboards are so much more reliable and faster. You can move around a lot faster on the lake with an outboard motor.
So when you say small, are you saying like 12-foot?
For the lifting boats.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the lifting boats when they were independent, didn't have a launch anymore. Most of the boats, people had 19-foot boats, usually
Okay.
fiberglass boats, and we would. Everybody up here was kind of poor. I mean, hey, we didn't have a lot of money. It was a rural area, and we usually took whatever boats we could find, we convert them over to fishing boats,
Okay.
which are usually sport boats. They'd either be aluminum. My brother and I, my father, we used aluminum boats quite a bit. And every year you're riveting them and trying to fix them. And most of the fishermen used fiberglass boats, and I got a fiberglass boat eventually. We'd take some fiberglass, like a pipestone 19-footer, and we'd just re-fiberglass the whole inside, tear out all the cockpits and everything, and put in stuff so it would be totally open so you could work.
Okay.
We did a lot of our own boat work and stuff, converting boats, and I'm sure we could have bought somewhere. There must have been boats that were made to do this, but hey, we just took what we could find around here and converted them over to be good gillnet boats.
Yeah. How big of a outboard were you running on something like that?
Something I know back when outboards, back in the 60s, man, when we forgot our first 100 horse or 80 horse Merc motor. You know, the Merc, they were kind of tall back in those days. The last motor I had was a V4 Johnston, 90 horse.
Okay.
And that was the motor that I liked a lot. And that would get us. Now sometimes when we'd be getting a lot of tulipies, we'd get a ton of tulipies, 2,000 pounds, 20 boxes of tulipies, and the whole boat would be full of tulipies, and you had to have enough power to get back to the harbor. And if it was windy, sometimes you were worried about running out of gas because you couldn't get the boat up planing, so you wanted to have power to do that, and so it was interesting. Our boats. We usually had pretty small pitch propellers, so you could get up and go with a big load of fish. And remember, we had a lot of fish boxes too. Whenever we would put the fish boxes in the boat, the smaller boat, 19-foot boat, they're just packed in there. If you don't have tulipy laying on the floor, put them in a fish box. And big waves, you know how boats are. They really bounce around a lot. When you're going with the wind, the boats yaw a lot. They have a tendency to yaw, and boats can get thrown around real fast.
Yeah.
We had to tie all the boxes in the boat so things wouldn't get thrown around. It wouldn't crush you as boat operator. So it was something we always had to worry about.
I'm guessing hitting a wave when you got a ton of tulipies in there probably isn't the most ideal thing to have if they've got boxes flying around. So
yeah, no, it was something you had to work. And all of us were very good small boat operators. And think of the sport fishermen, they go out there with their thing. Hey, but we were always carrying weight.
Yeah.
Probably never less than 1,000 pounds of ice.
Okay.
And 1,000 pounds of fish, sometimes up to 2,000 pounds. So you had to know how to make that boat go.
Yeah.
On big weather. You had to go anytime, and you deal with it. It was a lot of fun. Small boat operating is fun.
So you mentioned a couple of places that you've placed nets, but kind of where did you fish on the lake? Were there certain areas that don't go, that people didn't put their nets there because that's where Art is putting his nets? How did that work with the commercial fishermen?
Well, there was nothing official on that. The law didn't specify anything. The Vicarious, they had two licenses, Ed and his son Bob. Bob drowned in 71. They had two licenses. They fished up in Hay Island, which is Little Traverse, up north of Garden Island. And nobody else fished up there very much. Occasionally, me and my brother would, later years. The Brewsters, they had the house out on, which is still out there. I was out there last summer, in fact, the old Brewster house on Stony Point. And they would fish mainly fished right around Stony Point. Sandy Beach up there from Stony Point up to Driftwood. They fished that. And I don't think I ever fished there because, hey, they fished there, so we never fished there. The Arnesons fished right outside of Rocky Point, the Arnesons Reef out there. And they fished the Twin Rocks, Gull Rock. And Buzzy Lem, he fished right outside of his place on Long Point. Same with Don Hurd. So we had never fished over there. Let's see, then we had John Heinen. They converted the trawler over to a commercial gillnet license, and he fished mainly on the South Shore. And me and my brother, we fished pretty much everywhere. We fished Archie's Reef a lot. We didn't usually go as far. We fished the Garden Island Bar, actually quite a bit. We had a camp out there on Rudy's Point, which is south of Driftwood Point. And let's see who else was there. Back in the old days, Hugh Hilborn, he fished Knights Island. My father fished Knights Island. They fished right around Knights Island down to the Three Sisters Islands. Well, that was in Canada, but they did that. And I think that was it. I fished extensively the South Shore, and John Heinen fished down there some. But South Shore was the best fishing spot for me. Come September, I made most of my money in September and October.
Okay.
You try to catch some fish in June and July. We'd go way over to Garden Island. It's a long way to go. I could go out here 2 miles. I'm on the South Shore, and it was the best fishing ground, but only in September and October.
Okay.
There'd be no fish there. I'd sometimes fish up by Spring Steels, up to Elm Point, occasionally along Buffalo Point after Dorrance quit fishing. I would try to fish in there, but the South Shore was the most fertile ground for us.
Okay. So how did you know where to fish?
It was a sixth sense. No, I'm just kidding. We knew the patterns of the fish would move according to the wind.
Yeah.
And when we had onshore wind on the South Shore, we always had good walleye fishing. That was in September and October. If offshore wind, the walleyes would leave. But sometimes when we have offshore wind, we would get the tulipies that move in. So we heard, we would talk to all the people. George Bushy worked for me. Of course, my father, you talked to everybody and said, oh, yeah, I put a net out there and out there up on the north-south boundary, and boy, we got a lot of fish back in October. Archie Meyer, the name Archie Reef was named after, he would fish Archie's Reef. He said, August 1st, you're going to be guaranteed 500 pounds of walleyes on Archie's Reef. So we'd hear all those stories, and we would do it. Things were always changing. The wind would change all the time, and the Brewsters, they all knew where they fished. Arnesons and the herds, they all knew where they were fishing. My brother and I, we were kind of freelancers. We would just kind of fish wherever we could. Mm-hmm. The last years when we knew fishing was going to end, we were a little more, worked a lot harder at it and said, hey, I got to get as much fish as I can. I got to make as much money as I can because I know we're going to be. Mm-hmm. I'm building a new house, so I got to make sure I pay for my house, the new well that I built, and that kind of stuff. So
okay.
It was a lot of trial and error. Remembering what it was, you'd know some of the patterns, like how the fish would move according to winds. Yeah. And mainly talking to the older fishermen that had fished a lot.
Well, and by that point, when you're looking at the 1970s, 1980s, you're looking at almost a century of fishing at that point. To come out on the lake and try and figure it out. Just this place looks a little fishy to me. So
Well, as I always kind of laugh, and I shouldn't laugh too much, but when I say fishery science, to me it's kind of an oxymoron. Because they got their test nets and everything, and that's all cool and good, but things change so fast on the lake. It's I'm an engineer. We do geotechnical, but soil borings. You've probably seen them on bridges and stuff. Yeah, we do one soil boring. Yeah, there's a big rock over there. We don't know till we put in the bridge abutment. And it's fishing. It's the same way. It's kind of hit and miss, and it's not as standard as fisheries people like to make it out to be. It's the environment is so variable. It's kind of cool. Like, how do you read that environment?
Because you had mentioned earlier too about raising or having the gill net float for a full moon. Like, and how do you figure that out? Right?
Yeah, right.
With the winds one way versus winds another way, and so it's very interesting.
Yeah.
So, how did you know where to fish on the lake when you don't have GPS or Loran, or you know about these places, but how do you get there?
Well, that's a good question. Now, one time was kind of a secret. There's a fisherman, a commercial fisherman, one telling a sport fisherman how to find Archie's Reef, for example. And this is what I heard, back. So how do we find Archie's Reef, for example? It's out in the middle of the lake, 60 miles. Some people call it the 60-mile reef. It's called Archie's Reef. But anyway, we would line up things on shore. The way we'd find Archie's Reef is there's 3 points on Buffalo. We go out there and line up those 3 points, and you go out until 1.6, a little bit more. My father told me how to find it originally. And then Gull Rock, you can barely see Gull Rock over there about 8 miles. And that's lined up with some big pine tree, or maybe it was a church steeple, whatever it was. You just line everything up, and that's literally how you'd find them. And we did that for everything. The Boundary Reef, called the 12-mile reef, same thing with that. And it worked out pretty well. You would never not find your nets. And without using any kind of modern navigation aids. Now, I sail a lot on Lake Superior now, of course, and hey, we don't go on a boat without having at least 3 GPS units on it, right?
Yeah.
Well, hey, we didn't have any of that. And I teach navigation too, and excuse me, and it's how to teach people. Like, everybody's used to look at your little GPS unit and your little chart plotter. Well, and people don't know how you could find something without it, and you just use all the stuff on shore. That's how you do it. On a cloudy day, how would you find it on a foggy day?
Yeah.
And sometimes we'd go into shore, like we wanted to find our nets in Archie's Reef. We'd go into Buffalo, we could see it, and occasionally I would carry a compass with me, not very often. Then we'd go out on a compass line from Buffalo Point, or go into Gull Rock and go out on a compass line out from Gull Rock to hit Archie's Reef, or wherever happened to be where we're fishing. But normally we didn't even use compasses. We wouldn't find it. And sometimes we'd have to make a couple of trips, and hey, gas was cheap back in those days, and boats were fast. We'd run, I can't find it. Let me go again. Go find Gull Rock again. Go this way, you'll run into Gull Rock, okay, and then you'd find Gull Rock, and then you'd head out again and try to find it. But that was usually only a few days out of the year where you had difficulty finding it.
That dense fog.
That
was probably your biggest challenge.
Yeah, dense fog, or sometimes storms, real heavy rainstorms.
Okay.
You got visibility. But it was fun. It was a challenge, and it was fun.
So moving on now. I'm curious about when did you get your commercial fishing license? Because I know that there's been a lot of back and forth from even the 1940s. We're talking about with commercial fishing license. But when did you actually get your commercial fishing license?
Well, the first ones, as I mentioned earlier, was on trap nets. I actually got a trap net license, and that was probably back. I'm guessing. I moved back. Whenever there'd be a fishing license open, I'd come back to Warroad. I used to live down in Arizona. Blah blah blah. Did a bunch of stuff, but finally, we said, hey, let's try to get a trap net license. That was my first license, was a trap net license. It was totally unsuccessful, but I got it.
And that was issued from the DNR.
Yeah, yep, because they would issue new trap net licenses. The law says so many, and nobody ever fished trap nets for a good reason. I was dumb enough to try to make a go at it. Failed, but hey, we tried because we wanted to try to find some way to keep making a living on the lake. And we had big boats. We had the big boats with the 671 diesels in them. Everybody had a 671 diesel. And we didn't go up. So that was, I'm guessing, I'm guessing about maybe 1980, we started fishing trap nets or something. And then everything was getting controversial, of course. So let's had that. And it wasn't successful. And then the gill nets, you're probably wondering when I got a gill net license. I got the gill net license then when my father negotiated with Dick Knudsen, John Beckel, and Lauren Morey in the DNR that we restricted our nets off a bunch of areas on the lake in exchange for transferring gill net licenses. So then I bought Dwayne Brewster, Two Gun Brewster. I bought his license then. Because I was using his license already,
Mm-hmm.
because he wasn't fishing, so I would just pay him to use his license. And I bought all his stuff then, and so then I got his license. My brother got my dad's license, and all the Arneson boys got Lawrence and Clarence's license. And I forget what happened to, I don't know, if Buzzy Lem gave his license to his son. I don't remember. I don't know. Some of those are Brewsters. I don't think any of their kids were doing the Vicariouses. What was Bob's brother name? I forget. Anyway, we all sort of tried to transfer licenses. It was mainly the Arnesons and us that transferred licenses because, hey, our parents were old and we all wanted to fish.
So when you were fishing Two Guns license, now how did that work? Are you employed by Two Gun, or you're just paying to use his license?
Yeah, I'm paying to use his license. And in the DNR, we had I found him in the packet of stuff I gave to you. We had to apply for a helper's license.
Okay.
And so you had to have a helper's license to fish, and you had to put down who you were fishing on. And that was fairly loose. Nobody cared. Everybody knew that, Two Gun Brewster wasn't, he wasn't well. He wasn't going to be fishing. I used Frank McGuire's license over in Long Point. Who else's did I use? I just found any license I could find I would use. Get a helper's license, and then we could do it. We'd pay them for probably not a lot. I mean, back in those days, we're all poor. And I don't know, who knows, I probably paid Dwayne Brewster $1,000 a year to use his license or something.
Yeah, because at this point, there was a deal that got struck in the 1940s or so about there were no more, you couldn't pass down your license to your kids, and they weren't really issuing any new gill netting license. So yeah, you've got technically like an 80-year-old man who still has a commercial fishing license, but somebody else is operating it for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is an interesting.
Yeah, well, and the whole point of it was the DNR, of course. We'll get into the DNR, but they were trying to. DNR does not like gill nets. Why? I guess because the sportsmen don't like them. And why? Because of just a bunch of BS out there. But anyway, so they were trying to curtail the gill netting. So back in the 40s, they couldn't transfer licenses. Interesting, when my father he was in the Second World War, and when he did that, my mother was the license holder. Because in case he came back, they didn't want to lose the license. I think that stopped transfer before the war, I think. So then my mother was a license holder during the war when my father was off at war. Because they thought they were going to he went to war, he couldn't fish, then that they would then pull his license. So we did everything we could, and the DNR probably wasn't quite that bad to take a veteran's fishing license away, but there was a little distrust between the DNR and the commercial fishing, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then from, all like Hugh Hilborn, he moved away, his license was gone. Frank McGuire, he died, his license was gone. There was three Brewsters that fished at the end, Dave, Jed, and Jim, but their fathers both had licenses too. The two Roy Brewsters, they all had licenses. They died, their license gone. So we were down to 10 fishing licenses back when all the big controversy started back in 1980.
Okay.
It was after the trawler. I know we want to talk about the trawler too, but
So you get your DNR issued gill net license in what year again?
I got mine when we made the deal. It was 1982.
Okay.
The deal was made on February 2nd, 1982. I looked up all the stuff there before you came. You had to prompt me for some of that. It was kind of interesting history. I'd forgot some of it. But we got it on February 2nd. They made the deal. The commissioner's order came out, I think, in May. And as soon as that came out, we had to move real fast because we didn't trust anybody, rightfully so. And so we tried to transfer the whole thing. If you read my father's book, the whole thing was the DNR wanted the fishing to end, and we wanted the fishing to continue in some form. Gill nets were the only economical, viable alternative for fishing gear. And so the only way we could survive as fishermen was to get a gill net license, and they weren't issuing them anymore until that deal was struck where we restricted our areas where we could fish. And then, so then I got a license, and I got two gun roosters license.
Okay, so they weren't issuing any more license; they were just allowing the transfer
Yeah.
to happen.
Yep. So we had at that time there were 10. You know, the Roy Brewsters, they all lost theirs. Frank McGuire, Bob Vicarious, when he had died, you know, the license disappeared, and all those kind of things. So.
Okay, so you get the license in 1982, and then how long did you fish after that?
Let's see. I think 1985 was the last year. So, well, should we talk a little bit about the politics on that?
We might as well go into that right now.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. So anyway, here we tried trap nets. That was a failure. You know, we kept trying. My dad, Lauren Morey, John Beckel, and Dick Knutson, and Paul Hansen was a negotiator from the DNR. My dad talks about a lot in his book. They sat down and hammered out this agreement that we would restrict our fishing in certain areas and deeper water in exchange for transferring the licenses. So I got the license. That happened literally on February 2nd, 1982. Okay, so the next year was, you know, part of that agreement too was the University of Minnesota, Dr. George Spangler, who's a fisheries researcher down there, professor, they would have a big research study. So we still had our trap nets, so part of that research was that next year then, we were going to tag a lot of fish, and we used our trap nets. We fished off of Flake Island and Oak Island and Sugar Point, and my father and I did that. And so we put in our trap nets. We tagged a bunch of fish. That was part of the deal, and we didn't get paid for that at all. And, okay, we're kind of stupid sometimes, but anyway, and naive. But anyway, we did that. It was kind of fun. You know, a lot of people would come out and watch that. I remember, like Charlie McKeever, you know, one of the old lake men, and everybody would come out and watch us. And we used to get big walleyes, and we had trap nets. Let's say before trap nets got big walleyes. There's big walleyes out there. It's just you can't catch them. Gill nets won't catch big walleyes. And we got hundreds of these big walleyes. It was kind of fun. Everybody, oh my gosh, I've never seen so many big walleyes. So anyway, that was part of the deal. And then that year, of course, we fished. We thought everything was going fine. And then, let's see. Then the next year, and I think it was April 7th. I was, you know, it started heating up again. A lot of sportsmen did not like the deal as they found out, ooh, Art Johnston now has a fishing license. Ooh, that's bad. And he's young. He's only 35 years old. He won't die for another 50 years. And so they didn't like that, and a lot of people agitated again. And so, you know, again, dealing with Colin Peterson's office, and I think it was it April 7th, Colin Peterson and the DNR made a deal then that they would, the next year, that they would put a quota system on that eventually got codified into law. And that was done by the DNR and Colin Peterson, and of course all with all the agitation from the sport fishing groups. So that was so 82 was, we had a good year. 83, we got, they double crossed us, and we realized that they were going to, you know, the law then, which was passed in, I got the stuff over there.
Yeah.
Sometime in 83, the latter part of 83, the law passed that then put a quota on us, diminishing quota. They just made this up, right? Mm-hmm. And when they said gill net operation would stop in 1987, the gill nets are bad, right? Mm-hmm. Gill nets are bad. Trawlers are good. Pond nets are good. Blah blah blah. And so then that happened, and then that was going to become effective. And in the last year, the fishermen fish was 84. I fished in 85, or am I a year off on this? I'll have to look here. Sorry, Brady.
No, I think you're right. So
yeah.
The way that the law worked was there's a diminishing quantity on the amount of walleye that you could catch and keep in your gill nets, starting in 84, and then it worked all the way down. I think it even went up to 1993.
Yeah, when it was zero.
When it was, you would get zero. You were allowed to keep zero. So it didn't. the law didn't limit commercial fishermen from fishing. It just limited them from catching walleye in the most sustainable way.
Right.
And
And it also limited, but it did ban gill nets in '87.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And so commercial fishermen could keep fishing, but they couldn't catch the fish that could sell for any money.
Yeah, right.
So the DNR offered a buyout program. You could get paid for X% of the quota that you would have been able to get from 84 to 87.
Right. Yeah, it was in the law that they paid us $1.15 a pound for the walleyes. And then they put an 8% discount. I was reading all this kind of stuff here, Brady, so I was like, oh my God, we don't know anything about discount rates or anything. So that cut our money down even more because we would have known anything to say, hey, what a bunch of thieves and rip-off artists these people are. But hey, that's politics, and I've been involved in politics since quite a bit. But anyway, it was a pretty nasty deal.
Yeah.
But we did get money. I mean, there's one article you'll see in my stuff there. Colin Peterson he spoke to one of this was before the law was passed in '83. He said, well, these people are, and everybody admitted there was nothing wrong with the fish population in Lake of the Woods. Everybody said that, hey, yeah, it seems to be fine, nothing really wrong with it, contrary to what all these sportsman groups were claiming. But he said, he just can't put these people out of business. And so that's when the whole buyout came, and then the DNR jumped onto that really big. So the last year I fished, I think, was October 31st of '85.
Yep.
And then I got paid in '86 for my remaining quota,
Yep.
which was less.
Yep.
And it was obviously I was pretty unhappy with the situation. But you had to look at reality. You couldn't. The law was passed. There's nothing we could do. We had to accept that. So I fished. All the other fishermen took all the money they could and quit fishing. I said, "Screw you guys! I'm going to fish for another year." So I fished another year. But then the quota was getting so low that I'd be a fool to not take some kind of money. Mm-hmm. To go out and do something else. So I did. I took the money and I left Minnesota and never came back until 20 years ago. And I'm back again.
So 1985, and which it's a good thing that you did that, because that makes it, the estimates to beginning commercial fishing was 1885. So you sticking it out made it a full century of commercial fishing.
Oh, well, interesting.
So
that's really cool.